Hi, I'm Laurie Itkin. I'm a CDFA, which stands for Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. I practice throughout California. If you are divorcing in California, your attorney or mediator may say, hey, you need to get a Moore Marsden calculation done. Well, what the heck is a Moore Marsden calculation? This will be relevant to your case if either you or your spouse purchased real estate before marriage. Typically, we see this if somebody purchased a house or a condo before marriage. Now, it's very interesting because let's say you purchased the house or condo before marriage. It was titled as separate property, but you might have added your spouse to the title during the marriage, or you might not have added your spouse. Did you know that it's highly likely that even though you bought this as your separate property, your spouse has developed an interest in the equity? The community has developed an interest in the equity. And on the other side, you may be interested if your spouse bought the real estate property before marriage and is insinuating that you have no interest in that property. You may very well have an interest in that property. So let me walk you through some of the math that's involved here. So let's see if I can move this a bit. All right, so let me just shrink this a bit. No, that didn't help. I will maximize it. Okay, let me move this aside. All right, now, here's some of the math I did on a recent case. So I've obviously blacked out the personal information. It's all XXXXX. So in this situation, I used a variation of the Moore Marsden calculation. Now the Moore Marsden calculation is very simple, but it's rarely used because we have found, especially since over the past 10 years or so, we, until recently, were in a declining interest rate environment. During the pandemic, many people refinanced their mortgages to secure a 3%, a 2.75%, even lower in some cases. So the property had a mortgage with a much higher interest rate, and so people were refinancing. So these Moore Marsden calculations and their variations are very relevant these days. So in this case, the methodology I used was in remarriage of Branco. So there is, in California, there are statutes, but a lot of the things are determined by case law. And so let me walk you through the facts of this situation. In this case, wife was represented by an attorney. They were not in mediation. They were in litigation, and wife's attorney reached out to me and said, hey, can you see if my client, what the community interest is in the home, and what's their 50% share, because the community is the two of you combined, and so your portion is half the community share. So the history of this, the only name I'm showing is the husband's name, Brian. He purchased the property in 2002 with his previous spouse, and public records showed that he purchased the house for this amount, $447,500. Now, wife was able to get me the title history, and the title history does show the, well, it's either the property history or the title history, I forget what it's named, but there's a report that will show you the history of the property and the mortgages that were taken out and the initial balances of those mortgages. So we have he and maybe his wife, I don't really care, they took out a $300,000 mortgage, and so here's the equity, right? We take the purchase price minus the loan amount, that gets us the equity at that snapshot in time. Now, what I found in this title/history report or property report is that he had 4 refinances before he married my client. So I had to do a couple of assumptions here. So basically, they get married to my client. He'd already been divorced from his other wife, and then he marries my client in 2015. Remember, he's still the owner of this home. My client has no claim to this home. He's on title. So I had to make an assumption because we did not have a broker's opinion of value on the date of marriage, because I did this 10 years later. And so I just used the Zillow historical estimate. There's other ways you can get estimates. Again, it's an estimate, so it's not necessarily correct. It's just an estimate. And then I had to estimate the loan balance. So you can look at amortization schedules. If we know the interest rate, we know the term. We don't know if the client is making or the spouse is making additional principal payments. Again, we are using estimates if we don't have any real data. That's the best we can do, is estimates. And I always make it clear how I derive my estimates. What assumptions did I use? So we have, on the date of marriage, I've estimated that his equity in that property is $221,000. Now, this is very interesting, soon after the marriage, and it's not always soon after the marriage, but in this case it was very soon after the marriage, so less than a year after the marriage, he refinances. But what he probably doesn't realize is that when he refinances, he and his new wife together are paying off his old mortgage, and not just that, she gets put on title, because that happens a lot when you refinance the mortgage when you're married. Oftentimes the lender will put your spouse on title. He probably didn't know what was happening or not understanding the implications of this. Now, here's a PSA for you. I am a huge proponent of prenuptial agreements. How the guy got in a prenuptial agreement, this would have all been sorted out, but he didn't. And so my client, his wife, develops a community interest. So all of a sudden, the community, which is him and the new wife, has paid off his previous mortgage and have a new mortgage. Okay, so the equity hasn't increased that much because I used the appraised value, which may not be really accurate, but it was what the lender used. And people will argue about that. But again, I have to provide some piece of data to provide an estimate. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. The point is that we now look at the appreciation from the date of marriage, which was 10/1/2015, to the date of transmutation. What the heck is transmutation, Laurie? You're probably asking me. Well, transmutation was when the title of the property changed from his separate property to community property. That's called a transmutation. You can also transmute community property to separate property. I'm not an attorney, so I just am not going to try to define every scenario. You would talk to an attorney about that. But nonetheless, that's the general explanation of a transmutation. So we look at the appreciation of the home from date of marriage to date of transmutation. And then I had to make an estimate of the loan pay down, because what happens is that if you have an interest-only loan, this might not be relevant. What we're looking at is, did the community pay down principal, which would increase the equity position, right? When you pay down principal, you are increasing your equity in the home because you've less outstanding debt. Interest does not pay down principal, interest payments. So what I have is the estimated loan pay down with community property funds, because the new loan took over the old loan. of 400,000. And so the community property pro tanto percentage of the appreciation from date of marriage to date of transmutation was 89%. What's pro tanto? It is a Latin term. You've probably figured that out. And it's basically apportioning the appreciation between the community and him as the separatizer, they call him. He was a separate property guy. Separatizer, they call him. Separatizer. Is that right? So anyway, so then we take the community share of the appreciation since the date of marriage, because there is no community before the date of marriage, so there's no appreciation for the community from the date of marriage. So that's what I did. I took the appreciation here, I multiplied it by the pro tanto percentage, and then we get that the community share of the appreciation since the date of marriage is $25,922. And the loan balance on the date of transmutation was this, $417,000. So at the date of transmutation, that is when wife went on title, we have the community property equity is very small. That's all the community got. And then Brian's separate property equity is $224,000. So now, what does all this mean? Well, now this becomes a separate property reimbursement, Section 2640 of the Family Code. And so what this means is now, since the property is jointly titled, it is community property, any appreciation from the date of transmutation to the date the house is sold or the date a buyout is done, that the community owns that appreciation. The community is entitled to that appreciation. So my client is half the community and she's entitled to half that appreciation. So essentially, let's say the house is sold, the mortgage is paid off, all that jazz, the broker's paid. Her husband, Brian, would have a fixed claim of $224,000. So once we sell the house or there's a buyout and the mortgage is paid off, or it's not paid off if it's a buyout, but the point is that the equity is X, Brian gets to take $224,000 off the top of that equity. He is reimbursed dollar for dollar. No appreciation. No, we've already calculated that. The point is that this might be upsetting to Brian, but he just gets a dollar for dollar reimbursement for what his separate property claim was 10 years ago. So he gets that off the top, and then the remaining equity is divided 50-50 by the community. Okay, it has taken me 13 minutes to go through this and explain this. It's very complicated, and every situation is fact dependent. They're just not, these are all different. And I will work on these, because here's the deal on that. I have so many attorneys saying, Lori, do you do more Marsden calculations? Because the forensic accountants are very busy, they have long wait lists, and their minimum retainer is typically higher than mine. So I might say, okay, pay me a retainer of 5 hours, 6 hours. It just depends what records you have. If you have more records, I don't need to do digging and all that. But the point is if I'm charging a $1,500 retainer or a $2,000 retainer, that's going to be a lot less than some of the forensic accountants that have a minimum of $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 retainer. So essentially, you may need to get this done. Now, what I won't work on is if there was cash out refinances. We've seen over the years, particularly, recent years, where home prices have just skyrocketed. I have so many clients where since COVID, since the pandemic, they've had such huge appreciation of their home. and people have been using that equity like a piggy bank and taking money out, doing cash out refinances and taking money out. Those I won't do because those are even more difficult to calculate, particularly because there may be debates over whether the money was used for community property purposes, joint purposes, separate property purposes. It sort of skews the formula, and it's very difficult. So the easiest of these calculations, which frankly I have never done an easy one, is when the parties got married, one spouse owned the home before marriage, but the home was never refinanced. That's easy, and your mediator or attorney can probably do the math on that one. So with that, Laurie Yitkin, CDFA, more Marsden Branco. These are the situations, the calculations you may need to get done. Some CDFAs like me will do it, some will not. You may need a forensic accountant, you may not. But please reach out to me. If I can work with you on this, I will. If it's too complex, I'll refer you to one of my forensic accounting colleagues. Thanks for watching.